this video, we're going to be covering the last week of looking at Israel as a nation, because we're going to cover a lot of the rest of the history to finally get us up to speed with the New Testament and be able to go there. So I'm going to cover them again, the 10 Old Testament dates that everyone should know, because if you know them, they help a lot with the chronology and figuring out what's going on with whatever passage that you're reading in the Old Testament. So, circa 1950 is the patriarchs, the time of the patriarchs like Abraham. 1446 or 1250 is the time of the Exodus. 1200 is the conquest of Canaan. 1000, David's reign begins. 922, the kingdom splits. Israel and Ephraim to the north, Judah to the south. 722 is the destruction of that northern kingdom. The Assyrians destroy them and scatter the people. 622 is the discovery of the scroll, which is likely the book of Deuteronomy and the Josiah's reforms. 586 is the destruction of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians, but the Babylonians just take them into captivity. They don't scatter them. 522 is return of the exiles and temple restoration, and the rebuilding begins. And 400 is when Malachi begins prophesying. Now, in this lesson, we're going to cover all those dates from the time period of King David and on, so we can get up to the New Testament, as I said. In our last video, we covered the judges, and I said that the last judge was Samson. Depending on how I worded it, I could have been slightly misleading. I don't remember the exact wording, but Samson is the last judge in the book of Judges. There is another judge to come after him in the book of Samuel, and guess what the judge's name is? It is Samuel. Samuel is the final judge to be raised up. He's actually a really great guy and helps turn around Israel quite a bit. He's unique, though, because he's not just a judge, he's also a priest, and he's also a prophet. He's 3 of the 4 offices for which you could be anointed in Israel. They had prophets, priests, judges, and kings. And so Samuel's everything except for a king. But during his time period, he does a lot of great things in those 3 roles. During his time period and towards as he gets a little bit older, the people start to ask for a king. They say they wished they had a king like the other nations. That's really what they need. I think Gideon and his son Abimelech kind of proved that wrong, but that's what they thought. They thought they needed a king because, as it turns out, they weren't following God as their king. So the first king anointed is Saul, and then the next one is David. I think we've covered Saul and David enough for the purpose of these videos, and so we're going to skip from Judges and Samuel all the way to Solomon. It's not that far in history, actually, to skip straight to Solomon. But Solomon is the next king. He's the son of David. Now we're going to fly, and I'm not going to mention all the names of the kings. Most of them are not going to get mentioned, actually, because it's just going to confuse you. It's just going to confuse me. And so we're just going to cover the highlights of the rest of the time period up to the New Testament, at least up until the end of the Old Testament. So Solomon was the last king of United Kingdom. He built the temple. He asked for wisdom, and he received it. He and the nation became extremely wealthy. He either wrote or inspired the book of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. Unfortunately, though, his son split the kingdom into 2. So in 922, 10 of the tribes, because they did not want to follow Solomon's son because he did a kind of bad job starting off his rule, 10 of the tribes go and create their own nation and say, we want to rule ourselves. And then 2 of the other tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they make their own nation as well. They keep following Solomon's son. So there's the 10 tribes to the north, there's the southern 2 tribes to the south. So this is sometimes called the northern kingdom. It's sometimes called Israel. It's sometimes called Ephraim. It gets confusing because the southern kingdom is usually called Judah, even though there's Benjamin there. And unfortunately, the southern kingdom is also sometimes called Israel. So just do your best when you see it in the Bible. Just usually the northern is called Israel or Ephraim, and the southern is usually called Judah, but occasionally Israel, especially after the northern kingdom gets wiped out. That starts to happen. Now, for the rest of 1 Kings and all of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it covers this time period. But we do get a break talking about kings for about 15 chapters in the middle of it, when we get to hear about the stories of Elijah and Elisha, those really cool prophets who did many really neat things. It's also helpful to know that there were other prophets around this time period, especially a little bit after that time period, when there are still 2 nations of God's people. There's Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Jonah's even during this time period when there are still 2 nations. And it's often helpful to know which part of the nation is the one that is being spoken to during a prophetic book. Now, Jonah's a unique one because he doesn't speak to the people of God, but the letter is still written for the people of God, even though he's preaching elsewhere. It's a story still for the Israelites, both northern and southern kingdoms, I think. And so, if you want to know which prophet preaches to which section, that can be helpful to know. I've got a handout I can give you. I can't quite put the handout in a video, but if you would like that, I can upload that to the site so that you can see that handout. Just put that in the comments if you would like that. Now, both nations, the northern nation and the southern nation, existed side by side for about 200 years. Towards the end of the northern kingdom's time, though, they're the ones that fell first. There's what's called the Syro-Ephraimite War, and that is when Syria and Ephraim, the northern 10 tribes, they want help fending off against Assyria, which is just to the north of them. And so these two guys have aligned, and Judah down here, they say, hey, Judah, you're our brother, come help us fight the Assyrians. And Judah says no. And so instead of saying, okay, we should save our strength for fighting Assyria, Syria and Ephraim fight Judah in order to try and make him be friends with them so they can use his army. Don't ask me. The book of Isaiah is written during this time period, especially the first portion of Isaiah, and Isaiah tells the king several times, don't worry about this. God has it handled. Don't get upset. And actually what ends up happening is Assyria is kind of a sleeping giant, and they come, I don't know if he's asleep though, but they come and they destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, or those 12 tribes. And so now there is really only 2 tribes left. Assyria just wipes them out. There are 2 tribes left. Thankfully, though, Judah is the one that has Jerusalem within its borders. So it still has the temple. The Ark of the Covenant is still intact. Unfortunately, though, even though they've got the temple in their land, they kind of, as God puts it, they prostitute themselves out to other gods. And the temple gets filled up with other deities and other idols, things like that. Josiah is a young king, and he, during the time period of 622, so about 100 years after the northern kingdom is destroyed, he finds, as they're renovating part of the temple, he finds a scroll, at least the contractors do, and they bring the scroll to him. They read it to him in his presence, and as far as we know, we think the scroll is actually a copy of the book of Deuteronomy. And Josiah gets so upset hearing how the Israelites are actually supposed to live, and actually supposed to follow the God who set up their nation and set them free from slavery in Egypt. He institutes reforms, and a revival breaks out. Unfortunately, though, it is too little, too late. And the southern kingdom ends up falling as well, because they just don't actually do what they're supposed to do. They do revive for a short time period, and it's worth noting, but it does not last forever. The cycle continues. And so God, though, does not forget his promises to a nation, but his nation still is not following him, so he has to punish them somehow. So he promises to remember his people in some way. So Babylon rises up, conquers Judah, and instead of just wiping them out, actually takes them back to Babylon and preserves them in a somewhat safe area, as Babylon is the world superpower of that time period. After 70 years, which is as long as God says the exile is going to last, after 70 years they are set free and get to go home. Now, during this time period, and when they're Babylon, it's the time period of Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And then after that 70 years, they get to go home, and this is the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, Malachi preached during this time as well when the Israelites are home. Malachi, though, is the last one, as far as we know chronologically. And after that, there is no biblical book in our canon for those 400 years from when Malachi finishes preaching to the time of the New Testament. There are other stories of what happens with the Israelites. That's when you get like the Maccabees and the story of Hanukkah, but that is not canonical. That is separate writings. We sometimes call it deuterocanonical, which means they're good, useful books, but they're secondary to the canon. They're not part of the Bible itself. Now, I do realize that was a huge brain dump of just history, but the same thing took place throughout this history as it took place in the time of the judges. God's people fought and they split. The independent groups rebelled against God, and God allowed them to be punished. The northern tribe got wiped out because of how bad they sinned against God. The southern tribe also sinned heavily against God, but God remembered his people, was not going to let them be completely destroyed, because they are his plan to save the world. The promise has been made to the king who sits in the lineage of David. And so Judah was able to repent, spend time in Babylon, kind of licking its wounds in repentance. But they called out to God for help, and they saved, and they're eventually brought home to their homeland, where the Messiah is going to be born in the town of Bethlehem. And then they waited for a better salvation than simply just getting to go home. eventually a salvation that lets them go for real home to a land of true peace.